to, this will be the hardest part, hopefully. I'm going to take the screen and I'm going to throw my slides up if this works.
All right, I'm going to mute everybody. Let's see. Mute. Just make sure everybody's muted. Okay, you're the only one who's unmuted.
All right, great. So let me try that one more time and just make sure I can get it to work here. Can everyone see that slide?
Yep. Yep.
All right. I just can't get it to move yet, so let me see if I can. This is pretty common. Well, while I'm waiting, I think it just has to. First of all, Doug, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. I don't see Ben Bowman on board tonight, but he's the friend and the inventor. He lives in Avon who invited me and made the initial introduction. So maybe he'll join us a little bit later. I am coming to you from Boxford, Massachusetts, which is about 30 minutes north of Boston and 30 minutes south of New Hampshire. So in speaking to Doug, we determined that's pretty much nowhere, which is not a bad place to be in the middle of a pandemic. My newest book is called Innovation on Tap, as Doug said, and I had really had these two audiences in mind. One was just people interested in the history of innovation and the history of business, general history, but the other were entrepreneurs who were interested in improving their skills. What I'll do this evening is an overview of the book for the first group, but also we'll stop on a couple of the inventors and I'll tell a couple of stories and we'll talk about the kind of mini case studies and how innovation happens for the entrepreneurs in the audience. All right, I'm still not moving, so I'm going to back up one more time and try this one more time and see if I can. Can you all, I'm sorry about this. Well,
Would it help if I made you the host?
I don't think so. I think this will work. I've experienced this before, unfortunately, and generally it clears itself up in the time it takes me to do that little introduction. So I'll try one more time. Let's see if we can.
Can you advance the screen without being in full screen?
How's that? Now I've got it.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. So is that the second slide for everyone? Thanks for your patience. Okay. So my background is in business and entrepreneurship. Like many of yours, I have an MBA. And for many years, I was CEO of Sensitech, which is headquartered not far from me in Beverly. We were acquired in 2006 by Carrier Corporation. So at the time, Carrier was headquartered in Farmington and was part of UTC. So I made that run between Boxford and Farmington numerous times. A few years after the sale, I decided that I wanted to move to a consulting role because I wanted to do a little more writing. It was not my first opportunity. In 1999, I had co-authored a book about King Philip's War. So along with my MBA, I have a degree in history from Brown and really a love for that subject. And I thought, why not try to combine my interest in history with my background in entrepreneurship? And that's really how the book got started. As I was beginning the research process, the folks at Carrier discovered I had written about King Philip and asked me to write their corporate history, which became a book called Weathermakers to the World. And the research for that book let me spend time over 6, 7, 8 months in the Carrier archives in Syracuse, surrounded by Willis Carrier's correspondence and all of his engineering notebooks. And needless to say, Dr. Carrier would become one of the chapters in my new book. And then shortly after that, Carrier asked me to partner with their VP of Sustainability. And together we wrote a book called Food Foolish, which was based on some research being done by the United Nations that tied together food waste, hunger, and climate change. And the background research for that book really would help inform an entire section of my new book. So in one sense, I guess I had some delays, but in another, I had kind of a running start because of these two projects. So now I'm going to tell you an apocryphal story, which is a nice way of saying it probably didn't happen. But I tell it in the book, and it's a way to get at sort of the underlying philosophy of innovation on tap. A scientist publishes a paper that contains extraordinary findings about rats. In fact, the findings are so remarkable that a group of his colleagues decide they better visit him in his lab. And when they arrive, they find him standing near one of his benches, which is covered with beautiful, immaculate bound notebooks, and he announces, "Here is my research." And then he points to a little tiny cage in the corner and he says, "And there's my rat." This isn't a story about rats, right? It's a story about the logic of how we acquire knowledge, how we synthesize and draw conclusions. And it's kind of funny until it's not funny. And here's what I mean. Y'all remember this book. It's a biography of Steve Jobs. It was given to many CEOs as a holiday gift in December of 2011. But then, much to the horror of their teams, starting in January 2012, some of the CEOs began trying to act exactly like Steve Jobs, right down to the words and phrases he used. The CEO of Theranos is a good example, Elizabeth Holmes. John Kerry wrote in Bad Blood that her management team even knew what chapter she was on by the way she was talking and behaving that morning. In other words, Steve Jobs was her rat. By identifying one remarkable entrepreneur, she thought, that's the way to be successful. And there's nothing wrong with having aspirational role models. But the underlying logic of Innovation on Tap is that you want to know about as many rats, or in our case, as many remarkable entrepreneurs as you possibly can. None of them will perfectly describe the way you should build your business model or lead your company or compete in your market. But think of business history as an enormous laboratory full of amazing experiments conducted by entrepreneurs. The result of those experiments are instructive, and they are yours for the asking if you are willing to invest the energy to acquire the knowledge. I'm not a STEM major. I'm married to an engineer. I'm son of an engineer. I'm father of an engineer. So I'm close to STEM, but I always throw this slide in for the STEM majors, so they'll appreciate the laboratory. As I began my research, it didn't take me long to realize just how overwhelming a task it would be to try to organize 300 years of innovation history. So to make sense of it all, I created a virtual bar room where I could invite both living and dead entrepreneurs. And by bringing together the living, there were 10 in all, and the not so living, another 15, these individuals could compare stories and reinforce lessons. Or as Mark Twain is credited with saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So what Innovation on Tap suggests is that knowing some of those rhymes, at least for an entrepreneur, can be a competitive advantage. In fact, without history, everything's a surprise. Everything is the first ever, the best ever, the worst ever. So for an entrepreneur whose work is bound to be full of surprises anyway, historical perspective is a really helpful thing. So once I had the virtual bar, my next question was, who gets in? If I was going to write about entrepreneurs for 300 pages, I better define what one is. And for that, I needed a bouncer. So I turned to Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist who gave us the term creative destruction. Schumpeter was brilliant, and he was also a great character. His famous quote was, "Early in life, I had 3 ambitions. I wanted to be the greatest economist in the world, the greatest horseman in Austria, and the best lover in Vienna." And then he would pause, he would look you in the eye, and he would say, "Well, I never became the greatest horseman in Austria." And I thought, that's my bouncer, right? An economist with a sense of humor. He taught at Harvard from 1932 until his death in 1950. So when I put my bouncer at the door to check IDs, this is what he said. An entrepreneur does 2 things and only needs to do 2 things. He or she brings a novel combination to market. That is, combines 2 things or more that have never been combined before. They don't have to be new. They certainly don't have to be technology, right? So chocolate and peanut butter create a new candy bar, or putting wheels on luggage help us get through airports. But whatever that novel combination is, it disrupts an economic flow. If we were to say this sort of in today's English, you'd say an entrepreneur launches an innovation and creates new customers where none existed before. Schumpeter had a very clever way of making the distinction between launching any old business, a dry cleaner, a plumber, or an architectural firm, and launching a true entrepreneurial business. He said, add successively as many male coaches as you please, you will never get a railway thereby. And today we would say, look, launch as many new taxi companies as you want, you'll never create an Uber. So when guests show up at the door of our bar room wishing to enter, Schumpeter doesn't care if they drove a Tesla, or where they graduated from, or if they're courageous or extroverted or passionate, or even smart and ethical. He certainly doesn't care if they have a tech startup. He's looking for novel combinations that create new customers. Tech, non-tech, startup, large company, government, nonprofit, doesn't matter. And I was hoping that by defining entrepreneur this way, that young people reading the book would recognize that they don't have to be Steve Jobs or Elon Musk to be a successful entrepreneur. The ability to innovate, at least in America, is pervasive and open to anyone and everyone. Okay, so we've got some underlying philosophy, which is to say we want to meet a lot of rats. We have a virtual bar room. We know the kinds of guests we'd like to welcome in. And as I'm doing my research, 6 historical themes begin to emerge. And the publisher helped me to create a set of icons in the book to identify these themes and build a kind of roadmap for the reader. So let me follow this roadmap for you, and along the way, we'll stop and do some mini case studies. The earliest theme in innovation on tap is mechanization, and it's really the basis for the first industrial revolution. It's where New England really does well in the opening years of the early republic. If you were a person who could work with cams or gears or ratchets, if you could create a machine that replaced human labor, you had all kinds of possibilities as an entrepreneur. One of the entrepreneurs in the book who represents mechanization is Oliver Ames. He was born during the American Revolution. He will die during the American Civil War. He would spend much of his life producing shovels in the Massachusetts town of Easton. But that's not where he got his start. Oliver's brother David, who was 19 years older and I think more like a father to him than a brother, had been appointed by George Washington as the first superintendent of the Springfield Armory. And it was, of course, their job to supply the country with muskets. David invited young Oliver to apprentice there. So Oliver would spend the first 5 years of his career working with the finest iron workers and craftsmen in America, trying to build muskets, which were arguably the most complex, difficult product to manufacture in the early republic. It was as if your first job today was with Google or Apple, or when I graduated, Betty, with IBM or Xerox or Procter & Gamble, or maybe in my grandfather's day with Ford. These are companies that are so good, so leading edge, that they serve as kinds of graduate schools for would-be entrepreneurs. The Springfield Armory, along with the Slater Mill in Pawtucket, were really ground zero for the American Industrial Revolution. So when David Ames steps down as superintendent in 1802, he will go on to found the first paper-making enterprise in the Connecticut River Valley, which is commemorated by this marker in Springfield. Oliver returns to Easton, and he'll bring all this know-how about muskets and apply it to the manufacture of shovels. So Oliver's father is a traditional village blacksmith. His sons will one day produce 2/3 of all the shovels in the world. And he is the entrepreneur who will mechanize the process and span those 2 generations. Ames shovels will help fight the War of 1812. They'll help dig the Erie Canal, and they'll help build the Transcontinental Railroad. In fact, there's a monument in Wyoming between Cheyenne and Laramie at the highest point of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was designed by 2 heavyweights, H.H. Richardson and Augustus St. Gaudens, and it is dedicated to Oliver's sons, who helped both build and finance the Union Pacific Railroad. If you want to stay a little closer to home and you call ahead, you can visit the Ames shovel collection at Stonehill College. That wooden case on the right is the exhibit that the company put together for the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And Stonehill also holds Oliver's handwritten journals, which are revealing about how he thought about business. There's really nothing about revenues, nothing about profits. Occasionally there's a note about a new way of making a shovel or maybe a new patent that he's been awarded, but most of the entries are about water levels, water flows, water wheels, and the weather. Because no water, no power, no shovels. After Oliver's death, his son will continue the journals for another year, and the last entry on November 7th, 1864 is just one word, rainy, which in Oliver's world, before the widespread adoption of steam power, was a very good thing. Developers have done a fabulous job converting Oliver's old factory site into the Ames Shovel Works in Northeaston. And as I mentioned, Oliver's mechanization relied on giant water wheels. You can see one here. It's a recovered water wheel in the picture in the upper left. And these water wheels were used to power trip hammers. I'd never seen a trip hammer work, but there is one driven by a water wheel at the Saugus Iron Works, not too far from me. So I shot a short video. Oliver would create a template for a particular shovel and then stamp them out in quantity. You can compare that to a blacksmith that made shovels by hand, one by one, and you get a sense for the kind of mechanized magic that even the simplest machines like a trip hammer could create in the early 1800s. The other entrepreneur in our barroom who illustrates the potential of mechanization is Eli Whitney. He's one of America's first serial entrepreneurs. He is as interesting and controversial a character as you will meet. He invents the cotton gin, which breaks a bottleneck in the value chain from the cotton plant to clothing. And then he becomes a major producer of muskets for the US government. I can summarize the chapter on Whitney in this way. The cotton gin will make him famous, miserable, and poor, and muskets will make him famous, happy, and rich. Whitney's chapter is full of interesting questions for modern entrepreneurs, but the mini case study we'll focus on for just a minute is, how did he do it? Right? By that I mean, how did a New England farm boy, educated in Greek and rhetoric at Yale, who had never seen a cotton plant in his life, arrive in Georgia and within a few months, build a machine and solve a mechanical problem that had been unsolvable for a century? Was it really a flash of genius with which Whitney is often credited? Or can we explain it, I think, in a more practical and useful term for entrepreneurs? The question, how did he do it, by the way, really bugs historians. There was a book written as recently as 2016 challenging Whitney's claim to the invention. But my job in the book was to look at Eli Whitney through the lens of entrepreneurship, which, for example, includes the concept of open innovation. That is, having an outsider without a lot of industry baggage look at a problem through fresh eyes. For example, a Yale grad who had never seen a cotton plant. We know open innovation works. One study shows that 30% of cases that could not be solved by an experienced corporate research staff were solved by non-employees. In another open innovation study, observers found that 90% of the time, the individual who comes up with the solution doesn't have the background or the resume of someone you would hire to solve the problem. Steve Jobs says, look, creativity is just connecting the dots. Open innovation often brings a fresh set of dots. And in the case of Eli Whitney, I think I know exactly where those dots came from. Thanks to the New York Times, who digitized all of their old issues, I stumbled into an article, an interview with one of Whitney's contemporaries, published in 1852. It was a gentleman who lived on a plantation next door to Whitney in 1792. And it was told that Whitney got his first idea of the invention from a gin used to prepare rags for making paper, which he saw on a wrecked vessel. I read that and I thought, what? I had never seen that reference anywhere. And I'd been through all of Whitney's personal papers. We know that Whitney had escaped a shipwreck off Hellgate, which is off Manhattan, as he was making his way to Georgia for his first job. Was there some kind of a paper-making machine being carried on that ship that he might have seen? So I did a little research on paper making, and in 1792, it was exclusively a hand process, except for one point of mechanization, one machine that turned cloth rags to pulp called a Holland beater. Whitney's cotton gin design is on the left, the Holland beater is on the right. I can't prove it, but I think this machine served as a model for Whitney's invention. And this wouldn't be unusual, right? Some of you know that Samuel Colt conceived his idea for the revolver also aboard a sailing ship when he observed how the spokes of the ship's wheel aligned with its clutch. And Henry Ford's moving assembly line was inspired in part by the moving disassembly line one of the managers saw while visiting a Chicago meat packer. We do it all the time. So to help explain Whitney's flash of brilliance, there's great value in open innovation, right? And we also know that some of our best ideas come about by applying existing models to new situations, just connecting the dots in a different way. But there may be even a better lesson, one that combines these two ideas. This article was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2017, and it begins, imagine this. You are the owner of an office building, and your tenants are complaining about the elevator. It's old and slow, and you have to wait a lot. Several tenants are threatening to break their leases if you don't fix the problem. So when asked, most of us quickly identify some solutions. Replace the lift, right? Install a stronger motor, maybe upgrade the algorithms that run the lift. So the first framing of the question is inevitably, how do I make the elevator run more quickly? And we are paid as managers to be proactive and to solve problems quickly and efficiently. But what the managers of the building did was put mirrors up next to the elevator, and complaints plummeted. It turns out that people love to look at themselves. The problem the managers ended up solving was, how do I improve the elevator experience? And if we were together in a group, because we didn't have COVID and we could all talk, we might soon come up with another possibility. How do I shape peak demand? And I'm guessing that there are other ways to frame this problem. And it turns out it's kind of fun before you rush into solving a problem to try to reframe it first in ways that make for a cheaper or more elegant solution. So here's the problem that Whitney heard when he first arrived in Georgia. How do I separate green seeds from short staple cotton? This was the bottleneck for the most important industry in the world. I was about as clueless about cotton as Whitney, so I had a business trip to Arizona as I was researching the book, and I snuck off to find a cotton field. And I had a try at separating green seeds from the cotton staple, and it's not easy. Rule of thumb in Whitney's time was that one person could produce about 1 pound of clean cotton a day. And people who understood the textile business in 1792, 1793 knew that work on the cotton boll had to be done carefully to preserve the staple, to make sure that the staple was intact. Because the longer and more intact the staple, the easier it was for mills in England and New England to weave strong, smooth thread. So long staple varieties like Sea Island or Egyptian or Pima were more valuable. But the advantage of American green seed short staple cotton was that it could be grown anywhere. It had a 200-day growing season, which meant from Virginia to what would eventually be California. It was hardy, it was bug resistant, it was the cash crop that the United States desperately needed. Whitney was ignorant of these issues, which gave him a huge open innovation advantage. Instead of asking, how do I separate green seeds from short staple cotton? My hypothesis is he asked, how do I separate short staple cotton from green seeds? This reframing of the question sounds like nothing, but it changed the United States of America. It allowed Whitney to grab or trap the seeds in a grate and then spin some wire teeth through the staple that ripped the living daylights out of the cotton. The fluffy staple went flying up into the air like popcorn, and the seeds slid into a bin at the bottom of the machine. Nobody who knew anything about cotton or textile manufacture could have possibly dreamed up that contraption. The first machine Whitney built allowed one person to gin 50 pounds of clean cotton a day. In 1793, a 50 times improvement in productivity was a miracle. And once the machines got bigger and were hooked up to water and eventually steam power, they produced so much clean cotton so quickly and made so much money for the textile industry that manufacturers would soon adjust to what they had once perceived as inferior quality raw material, and short staple became a standard. When I started the research on Whitney, if I had run over a cotton gin in my driveway, I would not know what I hit, so I visited the Slater Mill in Pawtucket, and I shot a short video of what I would call a two-person second-generation Whitney cotton gin. You can see the staple sort of dance around like thistle. It's certainly not intact. And the seeds get ripped and down and sort of thrown down to the bottom right. So here's what we can learn from Whitney. First, open source innovation works. Second, innovation rhymes. Whoops. Old models can be applied to new problems. But the real lesson, I think, is this. Taking the time to reframe a problem may lead to a better solution. And to do that, we need to slow down just a little bit, to stop being the people who move fast and break things. Whitney's buried at the Grove Street Cemetery, right outside of Yale, which is beautiful and historic. It's worth visiting if you're in the area. Charles Goodyear is buried there, Jedediah Morse as well. And about 2 miles from there is a small museum at the site of the Whitney Historic Armory along Mill River. His son will continue to manufacture at this site after Eli's death. And later in the 19th century, Winchester rifles will be manufactured here. Was some fascinating archaeology done in the 1970s. So let me take a second just to summarize a few concepts. First, knowing history can be a competitive advantage. Not everything needs to be a surprise. Think of history as a lab and profit from the entrepreneurs that have already completed some of their experiments. Second, work with the best, especially at the start. Everyone wants to graduate and start a company. But working in your first job for a great company, for a great boss, with talented coworkers who understand how to bring innovation to market can create a template for success that will last your entire career. Oliver Ames' experience at the Springfield Armory gave him the tools and the network he relied on for the rest of his life. And third, the story of Eli Whitney suggests that open source innovation works and that innovation rhymes. Old models can be applied to new situations, but the real lesson might be this: find a better question. In other words, taking the time to reframe a problem instead of moving fast and breaking things could be the key to success. Okay, the second theme in Innovation on Tap, which really accelerates after the American Civil War, is mass production. This is mechanization on steroids. We start to see purpose-built machines linked together inside giant factories, the rise of the railroads, and the introduction of the telegraph. One of the entrepreneurs in the barroom who illustrates mass production is King Gillette. He's a traveling salesman for Crown Cork and Seal. It's a company that made disposable bottle stoppers and bottle caps. Gillette is a great salesman, but he's also an amateur inventor. And one day his boss challenges him to make a disposable product, something like a bottle cap that's meant to be thrown away. So in the summer of 1895, Gillette is shaving at his home in Boston, and he's using one of those old, heavy, forged, dangerous straight-edge razors. They were made primarily by German and English craftsmen. They had to be stropped before you use them and professionally sharpened from time to time. And they were hard to use, and if a guy had a little extra change in his pocket, he would typically visit a barbershop. So Gillette is staring out the window from his Boston home, sort of pondering life and pondering shaving, and he has a vision. At least this is the way he tells the story. And not long after, he patents a thin steel shaving blade with a handle to lock it down. Now, it's going to take him 6 years to make the first blade, but by 1918, after he and Uncle Sam have given away free razors to all American soldiers fighting in World War I, his facility in Boston will churn out 22 miles a day of sharpened steel. That's enough razor blades to stretch from New Haven to Wallingford for another mile every day. True mass production. Also in mass production, I had to feature Willis Carrier. I practically lived with him in the Syracuse archives for 6 months. Here he is graduating from Cornell in 1901, with his 6 co-founders in 1915, and as a success near his death in 1950. Carrier is the force behind the development of modern air conditioning. In many industries, it's just impossible to mass produce without stable and predictable humidity. Textiles, food, pharmaceuticals try to make gel caps in high humidity. Construction products, high tech, the cloud would be much more difficult to maintain without modern air conditioning. In fact, one of Carrier's earliest customers turns out to be Gillette, who couldn't keep their razor blades from rusting on the assembly line during humid summers without air conditioning. In the book, I tell the story of Willis's first installation of modern air conditioning in a printing shop in Brooklyn in 1902 to ensure that Judge magazine, a 4-color political humor magazine, could be printed on time every week. So in 1902, if you wanted to print 4 colors, you had to run the paper through the press 4 times, once for each color. Let's say it's August in Brooklyn, and you run 2 colors in the afternoon, and then you quit for the day. And that night, thunderstorms roll through, and the humidity rises or it falls, and the paper will expand or contract just a little bit. But when you run the 3rd color in the morning, the registry is off, and everything looks fuzzy, and you have to scrap the whole press run. That's the problem that Carrier is trying to solve. It wasn't about temperature. It wasn't about human comfort. Air conditioning was born on the factory floor to address a very specific production issue. So one of the lessons in this chapter worth discussing, again, especially with younger entrepreneurs, is this idea that you must focus on massive problems and that your goal should be to dent the universe. There's nothing wrong with thinking big, except to say we're pretty lousy at forecasting the future. What the history of entrepreneurship suggests is that entrepreneurs who dent the universe almost always start by trying to solve a small problem that will make the world better immediately for the people around them in the present. And then they let the universe take care of itself. Willis Carrier, newly minted Cornell grad, focused on getting the moisture out of the air in a building in Brooklyn so a magazine could get printed on time. But is considered today the father of a $140 billion HVAC industry, and with helping to create the American Sun Belt. The second part of the Carrier story that I tell in the book is the leap that air conditioning makes from the factory floor to consumers. This comes about through the launch of modern air conditioning on Memorial Day 1925 at the Rivoli Theater on Broadway. Because it turns out, when people expand and contract with humidity, they stop going to the movies in the summer. Many movie theaters in the South, and as far north as New England, closed down for a month or two during the hottest months of the year. Air conditioning solved that problem. In fact, you can add the birth of the summer blockbuster to Willis Carrier's dents in the universe. Okay, Carrier's Broadway success introduces the third theme of the book. Beginning after the Civil War, mass production creates a whole new problem in America. Businesses running out of customers. These giant automated factories were delivering more goods than Americans could purchase. And entrepreneurs had to learn to build customers as well as they built product. This is our world, right? Today, when you pitch to angels or venture after you describe your product or service, someone will ask, what's your value statement, right? How many potential customers are there? How do you segment them? How do you go to market? The blocking and tackling of modern marketing. One of the entrepreneurs I feature in this section of the book is Elizabeth Arden. She was a Canadian immigrant named Florence Nightingale Graham, moved to New York City in 1908 and built a billion-dollar empire that redefined beauty in America. The mini case study in this section involves a product Arden offered called the Vienna Youth Mask. It was paper mache and tin foil with electricity flowing through it, and it was supposed to remove wrinkles and make you look younger. Women paid in today's equivalent about $3,600 for 32 treatments in 1937, the depth of the Great Depression. It was a ton of money for a product that didn't work. It did not reduce wrinkles. Doctors tested it and were baffled. Scientists tested it and were baffled, but customers loved it. When I talk with young entrepreneurs about this product, the conversation often begins with the question, does your product actually have to work? Which is an interesting discussion all its own. But the better question for this particular case study turns out to be, what business was Elizabeth Arden really in? That will make some of you laugh because that's the first thing they hit you with at business school. And it sounds like a silly question, but it can be pretty complicated and it is really important. Maybe her product really did work. Maybe she just wasn't in the get rid of wrinkles business. When you walked through her signature red door, you were going to be pampered for the next few hours, away from the bread lines and the hard times out on the street, and maybe away from your children. And I'm thinking of some of you who might be parents in these days of homeschooling. Define that business properly. Maybe it was the just give me a few hours of peace so I don't go crazy business, and I can tell my spouse that I'm removing wrinkles, and you'll know what Elizabeth Arden was selling with her Vienna Youth Mask and why she was so successful. The text I usually highlight here is Ted Levitt's Marketing Myopia. His major lesson is sometimes translated as people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want to buy a quarter-inch hole, right? In other words, define your product or service in consumer terms, not product terms. And if you don't really know what you're selling, just listen to your customers. They'll tell you loud and clear. I also sometimes present the Bain Pyramid of Value, which I find helpful in terms of identifying and thinking through the different levels of consumer needs, which inevitably go way beyond functional needs. The reason I emphasize this question, what business are you really in, is the same reason that business schools do. Too many entrepreneurs pitch a great innovation without knowing the answer. And you can't possibly build a business model without first knowing what your real business is. Just as an aside, I subscribe to a service called Exploding Topics, and the #1 search term a few weeks ago was something called red light therapy. And the note says, red light therapy is used to treat a variety of skin conditions from wrinkles to psoriasis to scars. The therapy has been around since the early 90s. Despite decades of research, the clinical benefits of red light therapy remain up in the air. So many of us are still happy to purchase Vienna Youth Masks. I also feature in this third theme of innovation on tap the giant of American consumerism, Alfred Sloan, the CEO of General Motors. He helps invent the model year. He offers something called consumer finance. He perfects the centralized, decentralized organizational structure that we know so well. He invests in design thinking long before it's cool and in long-range R&D. And Sloan writes the must-have management book of his generation. And under his leadership, GM will become larger than half the countries in the world. The funny thing about Sloan, he was an introvert. They called him Silent Sloan. One contemporary described him as a functional, frivolous man. He had none of the dynamic charisma that we expect from our successful entrepreneurs. And that's another great lesson for young people. Sloan will crush Henry Ford. I believe he could have bankrupted Ford if he wasn't worried about the government coming after him as a monopolist. In fact, when Alfred thought Henry was going under, he encouraged one of his best friends, Walter Chrysler, to launch a competitor. So since we're in a barroom, I make a barroom argument in this chapter about Sloan. I believe he is the most successful entrepreneur in American history. It's unprovable, but it's fun to make the case. So let's take a moment to summarize a second set of concepts. First, recognize what business you're really in. Take the time to think it through. Test your conclusions with customers and never stop asking. Second, it's okay to solve the problem at hand. Have a positive impact on the people around you in the here and now, and let the universe take care of itself. And third, don't fall for the dominant narrative. Alfred Sloan was nothing like you would expect one of the great entrepreneurs in American history to be, and he was nothing like King Gillette, who was nothing like Elizabeth Arden, who was nothing like Eli Whitney. It's why you don't want to fill your head. It's why you don't want to fill your head with just one story about rats. You want many stories. It turns out, for most of us, it's okay to be yourself and pursue innovation and entrepreneurship in your own way. There is no single recipe. Okay, now that entrepreneurs are good at building product and building customers, we begin to overwhelm our environment. In 1935, a British scientist by the name of Arthur Tansley coins the term ecosystem. In 1962, Rachel Carson will publish Silent Spring. In 1974, the first World's Fair ever to feature conservation is Expo 74 in Spokane. And in 1988, a NASA scientist tells Congress about something he calls global warming. So in the same way that consumerism fixed the problems or tried to fix the problems of mass production, entrepreneurs now engage with something called sustainability to balance consumerism. So I started this section by welcoming into the barroom Stephen Mather, who founded the National Park Service, where you see the fight between sustainability and consumerism play out over a century. Mather's a fascinating guy in part because he overcame bipolar disorder. He was so high sometimes that people described him as being carbonated and so low sometimes that he was suicidal. What drew him to nature in the first place is that he found he could heal himself by being outdoors. And we now know there's some pretty good science behind this phenomenon. Mather's most effective lobbying is done during the famous Mather Mountain Party in 1915, when he takes high-ranking government officials, congressmen, scientists, and the director of the National Geographic Society hiking and riding into Sequoia, Giant Forest, Kern River Canyon, and most of them go up to the top of Mount Whitney. They'll spend about 3 weeks in the wilderness together. They all get nicknames, they all grow their beards, they skinny dip together, and when it's over, Mather has the support he needs for National Park Service. It's a piece of persuasive brilliance that would have been impossible for him to pull off in the closed corridors of Washington, D.C. By the way, Mather was famous earlier in his career for creating the 20 Mule Team Borax advertising campaign, which he did with $0. He created a viral marketing campaign that turned this white commodity into a national brand. It's an experience that directly contributes to his success in getting the National Park Service lobbied and launched. Okay, now at this point in Innovation on Tap, I begin introducing living entrepreneurs in the bar. These are people I got to meet with, that interview at Starbucks or in their corporate office. So along with Mather in the sustainability section, I profile Emily Rochon. She's an environmentalist and an attorney who worked with Earth Justice and Greenpeace, among others. Her job is to create new sustainable business models. And there's a huge focus in Innovation on Tap on business models. It starts with Whitney, who screws up his cotton gin business model and has a decade of heartaches. History and all those rats we study suggest that learning how to build and pivot your business model is really job number one for an entrepreneur. It's where your innovation meets your customer. A good business model can make up for horrendous leadership and even rotten culture sometimes. Also in the sustainability section, Kate Sincott is the executive director of Saha Global, which brings clean water to places in desperate need like Ghana. It's a fascinating story because Kate and her partner chose the simplest technology they could to create clean drinking water, because they recognize that the difficult innovation will be getting people to drink it. And their solution is brilliant. They end up identifying, training, and nurturing new local female entrepreneurs, people who can successfully operate these clean water businesses in each village and convince their neighbors to try them. And I also feature Viraj Puri. He's the CEO of Gotham Greens, a pioneer in the field of urban agriculture. Viraj's story involves turning down venture capital that was anxious to fund his growth until he felt he was ready to grow. You see the title of the chapters from one of his quotes, "Plants are not widgets." And if you want a true Schumpeterian novel combination, put a hydroponic garden on a rooftop in the middle of Manhattan. Okay, the fifth and other very current theme in the book gets its start about the same time the world begins thinking about sustainability. In 1946, at the University of Pennsylvania, ENIAC is constructed, the first modern computer. In 1964, the Library of Congress creates something called the Data Processing Office to oversee a small-scale computer installation. And in 1982, Time magazine names the computer its Person of the Year. And we're off to the races, right? We're fully engaged in something that we will now call digitization. So in this section, we feature Brenna Berman. She's the executive director of CityTech and the former CIO for the city of Chicago. She introduced predictive analytics into city government, for example, using data to help point her overworked health inspectors at the restaurants most likely to be in violation of code, or to anticipate the next outbreak of rats. She's all about how you build and define community in an urban setting. Jean Brownhill is the CEO of Sweeten. She has built an online community in the residential renovation space. Jean is one of the few Black female entrepreneurs who have raised more than $1 million in venture capital, and she's raised way more. Jean has dyslexia, which she didn't figure out until late in high school or early college, and she talks about the times that she had to, what she calls, rewire her brain to make sense of the world. One of my favorite scenes in the book is when Jean reads a biography of Warren Buffett and is so excited and impressed that she sends him a letter and he writes back to her. And it was kind of a turning point in her career. And I highlight Jason Jacobs, who turned his passion for running into one of the Apple Store's first 200 apps, Runkeeper, and formed a booming online community of runners. Okay, so those are the 5 themes. They're what I call dominant narratives in the book, and they each define an era and build on one another. But there is one more theme that runs alongside these 5 themes throughout all of American history, and it captures all kinds of innovation, often by people who are not able, or in some cases not allowed, to participate in the dominant narrative. And I call this theme social and cultural entrepreneurship. There are a bunch of interesting barroom entrepreneurs profiled under this theme. Thomas Downing is a Black entrepreneur who around 1820, while Whitney's building muskets and Oliver Ames is stamping out shovels, launches the first oyster house in New York City where men and women are allowed to dine together. A simple but norm-busting innovation. He ends up attracting the power brokers of Wall Street who are cutting deals upstairs in his restaurant while Downing is running a stop on the Underground Railroad downstairs in his oyster cellar. It's a great story. Buddy Bolden, King Bolden, was a masterful cornet player from New Orleans who may be the first American to play something that we will one day call jazz. And one of the interesting mini case studies in this chapter is to compare New Orleans in 1900 as an innovation community with Detroit in 1920, Alfred Sloan's Detroit, and Silicon Valley in 2000. They all worked in very similar ways. One used musical notes, one with clutches and carburetors, and one with software code. And then Branch Rickey, who with Jackie Robinson, of course, will change the face of baseball in America. I focus in this chapter on motivation. Did Rickey sign the first Black baseball player in the major leagues because Rickey was an ethical, moral Christian doing the right thing, as he sometimes told people, or because he was a brilliant capitalist who wanted to sell tickets and win the World Series, as he told people at other times? And if society wins either way, do we care? It's a fun study to talk through because it has implications for today's, for example, climate investments. And it talks about the leverage that occurs when doing good and doing well suddenly collide. And then the final essay in the book is about the creation of Hamilton. And it talks about innovation, these novel combinations, in a way that non-technical people immediately understand. For example, Thomas Jefferson is born in 1743. Rap music is born in the early 1980s. Neither is especially new, but combine them and something magical occurs. A brand new audience is created that never cared about Broadway and maybe about American history and is suddenly flocking to Broadway. A second lesson in this essay is how Lin-Manuel Miranda created an innovation team around him that magnified his already considerable talents. And I try to convince young entrepreneurs that there's not one skill, but many skills that go into a high-functioning innovation team. And chances are you possess one or more of those skills. But the most important ingredient is creating a sense of community, of shared purpose, even when the person who's forming the community happens to be a genius. So let me just briefly recap and reprioritize the lessons of innovation on tap, and we'll pull everything together. First, to beat a dead horse, knowing history is a competitive advantage. Profit from the experience of others. Second, community turns out to be an entrepreneur's superpower. I emphasize this lesson in Hamilton, but none of the entrepreneurs in the book would have been successful without their communities. And by community, I don't mean networking, which is important, but networking is a skill and community is a value. It's something that can be practiced every day. It means being open to the person who calls you out of the blue and just wants to get together and network, have coffee. It means reaching out to the person that you've worked with for 3 years but don't really know, or whom you've gone to class with for a couple of months and have never bothered to meet. 20 years later, having that person as a part of your community can change your life. The other 2 important lessons in red there from Innovation on Tap are: first, the business model is job number 1. Learn how to construct one, learn how to pivot. If you adore your innovation, that's okay, but you really want to have a love affair with your business model. And second, don't fall for the dominant narrative. There are successful rats of every shape and size. We all have strengths. We all have weaknesses. If you construct a community that complements your skills, you will have a fighting chance to be a successful entrepreneur. So that's Innovation on Tap. It's out in hardcover. It's on Kindle. You can jog or commute with it on Audible. If you'd like to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I also keep a blog. It's called The Occasional CEO. I have a number of resources related to the book. There are some chapters that got cut because of length. I overwrote the book. And a free guide for book groups. So if you'd like to assemble a monthly book group at your company, for example, you can use the chapters as mini case studies. So thank you for your interest. And now I'm going to turn things back over to Doug.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Eric. Are there any questions? You'll have to unmute yourselves if you have any questions. Bill, are you trying to talk? I think you might be muted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now.
All right.
Okay, firstly, Eric, absolutely fabulous presentation and in-depth research must take a hell of a long time to put all this stuff together. Just and extremely interesting. And a couple of things that always come to mind, and I'm talking kind of in a random manner, with all success in various areas of invention, what are the casualty lists? The guys that almost tried